her master's in English and Literary Arts from the Breadloaf School of English. Her name is Wangeci Gitau, one of my best friends, a true inspiration to me. She be teaching me so much. She be getting on me about not writing when I'm supposed to write. And she's been an educator in Lawrence for over, 5, 6 years, 7 years? 7 years. Make some noise for Wangeci Gitau.
Hello, hi everybody. It's great to be back here. I remember I was here a year ago for the kickback, which we're talking about a lot of the same things. So we're just going to continue that conversation. And so I'm just going to have the panelists come up here. I know there's about 4 of y'all, so you can come up here, and then we're going to do some introductions, and then we're going to talk about what we saw today. All right. So if you have any good questions, write them down, remember them, and then we'll get to it. So go ahead. Can we have a hand for our panelists today? You'll recognize them from the documentary, but also outside the documentary, they've been doing so much important work. And also shout out the team for the amount of research that y'all have done that I have wanted personally to do. Y'all need to release the docs, the Google Doc with all the links or whatever, because I need this research. So we're gonna start with Mr. Dr. Domingo Morel, who I remember a year ago I told y'all to read this book. Do y'all remember that? Okay, I love this book. I bring this book with me a lot of different places. So Dr. Domingo Morel is an associate professor at New York University's Robert Wagner School of Public Service and holds a joint appointment at NYU's Will Family Department of Politics. His research focuses on racial and ethnic politics, urban politics, educational politics, and public policy. He is the author of Takeover: Race, Education, and American Democracy, which you saw a lot in that film. And he won the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award for this book. He's also the co-editor of Latino Mayors, Power and Change in the Post-Industrial City. And he's recently published a book called Developing Scholars, Race Politics, and the Pursuit of Higher Education. Let's hear it for Dr. Morel. Next, we have Awilda. Awilda Reinoso. Awilda and I went to high school together. So, Awilda Reinoso Lopez holds her bachelor's in economics from Clark University and a master's in urban educational policy from Brown University. She has over 8 years of professional experience working and advocating for systemic change, social justice, and equity on behalf of BIPOC communities through public policy, educational policy, strategic planning, grant making, community engagement, economic mobility, leadership representation, and advocacy. Awilda believes in lifting our existence and amplifying our narratives and our journeys. Let's give it up for Awilda. All right, next up we have Marianela. Marianela, Dr. Rivera, who also graduated with me from Oxford this summer, shout out Dr. Rivera, is a physical therapist and has focused the majority of her career on serving students receiving special education services. Her experiences while working for Lawrence Public Schools revealed systemic issues impacting students and their families, which motivated her to run and win a last-minute write-in campaign for the Lawrence School Committee in 2015. That's right. Dr. Rivera's efforts helped organize parents, teachers, students, activists, and concerned citizens to propel public education forward with the Fund Our Future campaign that led to the passing of the Student Opportunity Act. Dr. Rivera was one of the first table coordinators of the Greater Lawrence Education Justice Alliance, a role that was taken over by Cassie Infante in 2020. Thank you, Dr. Rivera. And then finally, we have Angelica Brito Castillo. Angelica is a 17-year-old Dominican artist and a passionate social justice activist from Lawrence High School. She enjoys calligraphy as well as advocating for critical issues such as period poverty and women's rights. Give me a second. through projects dedicated to building awareness and creating solutions. She actively volunteers in her community across food pantries and community organizations around Lawrence and serves as a leader of the National Honor Society governing board at her school. Looking ahead, Angelica plans to pursue a degree in either political science or sociology, aiming to use her artistic voice to advocate for change and to empower marginalized communities. Give it up for Angelica. That's right, go Lancers. All right, so we saw a lot in that documentary today. And so I got to see it early, so my emotions were kind of processed prior to this moment. But I was very emotional when I watched it. And I think part of the reason why is because, so I'm from Kenya, and Kenya is a country that was occupied by the British, right? And a lot of us come from places that were occupied at some point. And the more that I look into my history and I study occupations, and we see a lot of occupations today, I see a lot of parallels to LPS. I'm always like, oh, that's what they're doing in Lawrence. Like, I think that to myself a lot, right? I'll give you an example. So I was reading something about how in Kenya, all the teachers in like 1950s Kenya, which is in Africa, right? All the teachers were white. And I was like, how are all the teachers white in Africa? And then I was like, wait, that's like Lawrence. Doesn't make sense. And so, in the documentary, we see Jeff Riley, who kind of even alludes to this dynamic, right? He says, this could have been an outside occupying force, right? When he's in the press conference. The question is receivership an occupation, right? And how can we use this to study other occupations or use other occupations to study this moment that we're seeing here in Lawrence?
I would actually like to let the professionals speak first, because they're way more capable of speaking more broadly about the topic.
Yeah, you can cut off and I can talk about.
Okay, so yes, in short, it is an occupation, and that's the way we need to be thinking about it, as an occupation. So there's, like, when I try to tell people, one of the strategies that occupying forces do is when they bring in this case, a takeover, what they'll do is that they'll bring in someone from that community thinks is one of their own as that person to lead them. So if you're in Newark, Philadelphia, Detroit, you're going to bring in an African-American superintendent or receiver, because they're going to think like, well, this is not this outside occupying force. In Providence, that also experienced a state takeover, the commissioner is a Dominican woman. And so then the Dominican community, the largest part of the student attending population in Providence is Dominican. So you're gonna think, well, this person has their best interest in mind for us as well. But you always have to ask two questions. Who brought you here, and who do you have to answer to? If we didn't bring you here, and you don't have to answer to us, I don't care if you're Dominican, I don't care if you're black, I don't care if you're Asian, you're not accountable to us. And therefore, you are an occupier just like everyone else. So we need to be thinking about what's happening in Lawrence, like what's happening in Providence, like what's happening in Newark, Detroit, Philadelphia, name it, right? All these cities with majority populations of color as being occupied by state authorities.
I think, by the way, I love Dr. Morel because in 2018, when I went to Brown University, I decided I wanted to study the state takeover, state receivership, and I found this book. And I found that he went to Brown. So it's been an honor just seeing your evolution and your research, and then being able to work with you as well as we continue the fight to defend public schools. I think one thing I would add too is this perception of leadership too, right? Like, these people are not well equipped to be able to handle the resources, the budgeting, the policy analysis that it's happening on the ground, right? And so now you have black and brown kids looking up to people who don't look like them, making decisions for them, which is very serious, right? Because now you have students who don't believe in themselves and that it's on purpose, right? And so we really have to fundamentally question, what is the purpose of schooling, right? Create that space for imagination. Because that's not what they want, right? And so that's something that even me, myself, who went to Lawrence High School, I'm an alum, graduated class of 2011, right? I left in June 2011, and it was taken over November 2011, right? And it's so crazy to think, you know, after 13 years, that we're still having this conversation. The same old conversation we had a decade ago. We're still having the same conversation, y'all, right? And so I'm super excited to talk to you all about it, but that's the question, so we'll stay for there.
Just want to add to that. As a former school committee member, it definitely felt like an oppressive, occupying force. There were so many instances in which I would talk to students, to parents about their concerns in terms of what was happening in our schools under receivership. And we couldn't even put items on the agenda for discussion, let alone even try to vote on policy. So it very much felt like taxation without representation, right? We're all paying our taxes to the community, it's going to our schools, but yet we don't have power at the school committee level to enact policy or remediate any of the issues that were happening under receivership. So I would very much qualify it as an occupying force for sure.
Thank you so much.
I also agree with everything that they say. This is totally an occupation that's affecting us students, and it really feels like an outsider, like they mentioned, is telling me what to do. Somebody who didn't come to from the same place that I came from, doesn't have the same background as me. It's not constantly in my school, seeing how I am performing, seeing how the school environment is like my superintendent. It's not like my school committee. It's not somebody who's constantly there trying to see what they can do to help me as a student. It's just somebody who is getting the money, who is taking decisions based on the data that's probably, as we saw in the documentary, very not reliable. So yes, this is a takeover, and it's not okay.
Thank you so much. And yeah, and I think as an educator as well, I think of it as such a missed opportunity as well, because, you know, there's so many issues right now happening around occupation, right? And, you know, we talk about how it's too complicated for kids to understand. And I think when we don't phrase this as an occupation, then we also miss an opportunity to talk about how we have been occupied in other ways. And because they won't talk about this, like they definitely won't talk about that. Right? And so, yeah, I just want to name that as a missed opportunity of the school system, which means we're also not educated in that way. So let's go to Angelica, because, you know, you are a student, obviously, who knows, right? You know the thing. You all know the thing, right? There have to be students who don't know. And I know me as a teacher who taught 8th grade, so many students try to get out of going to Lawrence High, right? They want to switch out of the district. They want to apply to all these other schools. They're being told that Lawrence High is bad. And the ones who end up going, they internalize that feeling and they're like, oh, there's something wrong with me, right? I don't deserve this education. I don't deserve to be a good kid, right? So what is the difference between knowing that this is an occupation and knowing that you're on the right side versus you think like your peers who might not know what's going on?
Honestly, I feel like knowing that my school is under receivership is like a constant fight to try to prove them wrong, to try to perform to the standards that they want me to perform over. It's a constant fight to try to tell them that my school, the kids in my classes are capable of not being controlled by an outside force that they don't understand what it's like. And me as a person, I really feel very like I don't have power over what's being done, and there's honestly nothing that I feel like I could do. And I feel like for the kids who don't know where receivership is, and for the kids who think that Lawrence High School is just a bad school and that Lawrence High School has not a way to escape the years of being oppressed by these people that are on top of them, taking decisions. I think it could be really frustrating not to have that answer to why Lawrence High School is how it is. And I think we should start educating kids about receivership, and it could be very frustrating for them, I believe, because I didn't know what receivership was probably like a year ago. And when I learned what it was, I was really shocked by how long it's been in the school and how much it has affected me without knowing. So there's a lot of people who are being affected right now, who have no clue where the root of this problem is coming from. And it's really, really like sentimental for me to know that there's no one out there telling these kids, it's not your problem, you're not wrong, you're a great student. However, your school system is failing you. It's not you that are failing. So it's really sentimental to me. But.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else want to take that as former students, as parents, as educators?
I think for myself, attending the school prior when it happened, the receivership, let's be real, it was always level 5, even when I was there. I remember distinctively, I applied to go into BMF. At that time, we had the 6 academies. Y'all remember that?
Yeah.
And we had to put our top 3 schools, right? I went to the Frost Middle School, and then I went to the Arlington, and I graduated from the Arlington. And so I remember going to BMF, and I had to take the test, right? Because I had to place you. I was placed high, so they were like, we can't support you as an academic student. We need to send you over to MST, which is the Math, Science, and Technology. Now, I was sent to a school that was able to support me academically by taking honors and AP courses for me to be able to apply to college. But not every student got that chance because of a standardized test that is, by the way, y'all, it's very arbitrary. It does not define the successes that actually lead to people to succeed in the future, like the social and political and economic, factors that really matter. And so being a student and thinking about the students right now, it hurts my heart because I don't think people understand the next, the decades of damage that this is gonna do, right? It's the same vicious cycle of violence, of drug, abuse, substance abuse, right? The fact that these people can't even afford rent, right? I think about the long-term damages that people don't think about right now because they're too busy to think about how to survive today, right? And so I don't blame for students not, really knowing what's happening because that's what they want, right? They don't want the students to know. We have so many distractions nowadays, right? For you to be able to know exactly what's going on. But as a former student who, and I was telling Domingo this earlier, I'm like, I feel like I was abused in the system and I was just able to keep pushing because I had family members like my parents who said, I believe in you, right? But not every student has that. And so then what for those students who don't have that? We're just gonna leave them on the side? And so I think about that, and I think about how this is happening only in Black and brown school districts. This is not happening in white towns at all.
Yeah, anybody want to add to that?
I just want to add one thing, and I think it's really important from Angelica's standpoint and what others have been sharing too. One thing I strongly encourage everyone to do is to get away from using the term receivership. Because what is receivership, right? So first of all, a student would not know what a receivership is, right? And it doesn't sound like it's something like that harmful. You're receiving us. Receiving us could be something good, right? And so the language is really important. And so if you think it's an occupation, I think most of us here would agree that it's an occupation, then let's start saying it's an occupation. I use the word takeover because that's what I think it is, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be an occupation. In fact, part of the research that I'm doing now is to say that these are actually coups, and it's been happening a lot longer than we think. So I wrote this book the research that I did for this book is after the 1960s, because this starts to emerge like in the 1970s, 1980s. But this stuff has been happening since the end of the Civil War. Black communities, once they gain political power, state governments have been taking over black communities dating back to the 1870s. So it's 100 years older. And so when we think about it in that time frame, then certainly receivership doesn't do it justice. I'm thinking takeover doesn't do it justice. It's really a coup of local governments, right? And so I would just encourage you, as you do the work of organizing your community, which is this is a really important part of what you're doing here in organizing your community, is to use the language that really conveys the urgency of what it is that you're experiencing, so that people can then think about it and organize around it, because I don't think receivership does that.
Yeah, and I think some of the language also in your book, page 29 if you have it, is talked about sometimes they try to avoid making it seem like colonization, right? The word colonization is used. I think about residential schools a lot, right? I think about the way that residential schools in the U.S. functioned, and also like how they functioned outside of the U.S. and how that is similar to what's happening in Lawrence High. I also think about, I think as a student, I felt like it was more like a missionary school. I don't know if you guys have studied missionary schools, but there's that vibe to it. Or even that the word plantation, I think, comes up as well in the text. And I feel like that's, for me, what I think of when I think about receivership. So, yeah. Marianela, you have anything to add?
No, they just passed me the mic. So
Okay,
I'm
great.
over here waiting for the next one.
That's all right. We can jump to you, actually. So, you know, in the documentary, we saw that that clip where they're writing down the 4 things that they're going to do with the school system, right? Like their 4 sort of pillars of how they're going to turn around the schools. And we see one of them that talks about how they're going to hire great people. Okay, very vague language for such a serious project. And having been an educator and being employed by LPS, which I am no longer, so now I can say this, I can tell you the kind of people that they hire. And I noticed one of the things that one of my bosses used to do all the time is like literally tally how often I would tally how often she would say like, we have a great staff. This is the greatest staff. I love this staff. She would say it so often that I would tally it. And I wasn't even doing it for any reason except that she said it so often. And now when I see this language, I'm like, oh, it's like, it's coming down, right? And another thing, I'll tell you a quick story is, when I did my teacher training, regrettably, I did Teach for America, and we can talk about that for a lot. We can talk about that later, regrettably. And I remember being one of the only teachers from Lawrence in my cohort, right? There was about 300 of us. I was the only one from Lawrence, even though we all taught in Lawrence that summer. And I remember this one time, they had Jeff Riley come out. And Jeff Riley gave like a speech, and everybody was clapping for Jeff Riley. And I'm like, this man is a villain. Why y'all clapping? Right? And then the narrative became like, oh, be quiet, you're so rowdy. And they were trying to police me for being critical of Jeff Riley. And the argument that they used is that I was a Lawrence person, so I wasn't educated or civilized enough to like sit in this room and listen to a man give a speech. And I'm like, y'all think that I'm the one who's uncivilized? That's interesting, right? Which then plays into the ways that the school system runs now, right? And it's interesting because a lot of those people are not here right now. Right? They've taught in the system for years, but they're not here in this room with us. So the narratives that they're receiving are very different than the ones that we're receiving. So Marianela, can you speak to what does that mean? What are the implications of hiring great people, and how do we see that play out today?
This is a great question, by the way, and it's bringing up so many emotions. Because I was born and raised here in Lawrence, and Lawrence is such a special place to me that I wanted to work for our local school system. I wanted to work for Lawrence Public Schools and give back to my community and be the teacher, the educator that I didn't have growing up. I never had any educators that looked like me growing up. And I worked for the district back in 2013, 2014. And I don't know if y'all recall, there was a couple articles, one in the Eagle Tribune and one in the Globe, that talked about the 59 teachers that were dismissed. I was one of those educators, and I was told that I was not a good fit. And so they pushed out Latino educators from Lawrence to make room for quote unquote great teachers. And so what we saw TFA teachers come in, not you, but TFA teachers come in from all across America that didn't look like our students, that didn't understand the culture of the community. And so that's what we saw as quote unquote great teachers, which was highly problematic because part of what they did with receivership was disempower the local teachers union. And our local teachers union, and even at the state level, has done a lot of organizing, for the Student Opportunity Act, Fund Our Future campaign, all the things to really uplift the voices of the students in their classroom and give back to the community and really fight for educational justice. So when I hear, like great teachers, under this, under the receivership, what they really mean by great teachers are teachers that are gonna come into the community for 2 years, do their TFA service, bounce, and not really push back. They're gonna conform to whatever rules or whatever policies that are being pushed under the receivership. Whereas the educators that we have here in Lawrence that are like committed to the community, they're gonna fight for their students. And so great teachers to me is synonymous with conformity, not pushing back, so that the receivership can do whatever it is they need to do.
Can you speak a little bit about your work trying to fix that problem? Because I know you have some solutions to that.
Oh, well, I can. I'm currently an academic coach at UMass Lowell for this awesome Grow Your Own program. We've been working in partnership with the Lawrence Public Schools to identify local paraprofessionals who want to earn a free bachelor's in education and become licensed teachers. So we are actively trying to diversify the educator workforce because it currently is, majority white, and we really want to make intentional efforts at really bringing those great teachers to the classrooms, the teachers that grew up here in Lawrence, the teachers that speak Spanish, that understand the culture, that aren't going to shove the students down the school to prison pipeline, that are going to be supportive, right? So we're making intentional efforts to diversify the educator workforce and really bring additional great teachers to Lawrence.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your work. Anybody else want to touch on the great people language?
So that's really important because, again, Lawrence is no different than every other district in this country that has experienced a takeover. And so this is definitely one of those things. So New Orleans the state of Louisiana took over the New Orleans public schools after Hurricane Katrina. Mm-hmm. And New Orleans had the largest black teaching force in the country before the takeover. And following the takeover, within a 10-year period, it went from roughly 80% of the teachers being black to about 50% of the teachers being black. And those teachers that came in were Teach for America teachers, right? And many of them are no longer there. Okay. So there was this massive disruption within the community, and they're still having to deal with that. And so to Marianela's point, about those TFA teachers were not going to come in and protest the takeover. Right. They weren't going to defend that community because they're not from that community. So the people that were going to be, which has always been the case in communities, is that black teachers, Latino teachers from the communities are the defenders of the community. That's so right. You need to remove them to then impose these types of policies that are harmful to the community. And so Lawrence is no different than New Orleans, than many of these other cities who've experienced similar kind of things.
Yeah, and shout out to those of us who've tried and got pushed out. I know there's a couple of us in the room, and I think for me, I'm really sad. I wanted to be a teacher, really. I really wanted to be a teacher. Or so many of the people I look up to are teachers. And so shout out to those of us who tried really hard to defend our communities. Great. So moving along, Dr. Morel. Many of us are familiar with the home rule petition. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the home rule petition. Okay, yeah, this is something that's happening right now in the city. And I feel like we're being hit with so many things right now. And so in the last year, not even 6 months, the mayor has decided that it is, we need to have a majority appointed school committee. Right? And so instead of having a functioning school board, which we don't even have under receivership, they're saying that in order for us to get out of receivership, the mayor needs to be able to choose the people on the school committee, which is okay, isn't that what was happening under receivership essentially? So this is happening, and it has to change, they have to change the charter of the city in order to do it, which is such a wild thing to do, right? Because this will live past this mayor. This will always be what's going on in the city. And so, in your research, Dr. Morel, do you see these kind of political moves being strongly suggested as the price of getting out of receivership? And do we need to take that deal, quote unquote, in order to be out of receivership?
No, you don't need to take that deal, and you shouldn't take that deal. In fact, this approach it's no different than a takeover, right? So, Boston, who's had a mayoral appointed board, Chicago, who's had a mayoral appointed board, New York City, who's had a mayoral appointed board. They actually have mayoral appointed boards because the state took the power away from the locally elected board and gave it to the mayor. The state was saying, we don't want to run the school district, but it's better that you, the mayor, run it rather than the community because we don't trust the community to run the schools. So this ploy, to make it appear like it's a step towards local control, it's really the same deal. And so I encourage you to fight against that just as strongly as you've been fighting against the state control of the schools. That's
right, yeah, and we've been there back to back, and I always quote from your book when I'm talking to the city council, so thank you for that. Awilda, I have a question for you. And so I know you've been doing some work in Providence, right? And so can you talk about some of that work and how can we build coalitions with other communities that are going through something similar?
Yeah, that's a great and timely question. Solutions, yay. So I am from Lawrence, and I'm diehard Lawrence. Hometown is home, right? But I am currently in Providence. I work for an organization called the Latino Policy Institute, and part of my job is to do research and data and analysis, but also advocacy on the ground to represent the best interests of Latinos. And so we partnered up with a sister organization, community grassroots, shout out to them. It's called Parents Leading for Educational Equity, run by Ramona Santos. She's also Dominican. And so what we're doing right now is a school governance and democracy series, where it's a 4-part series. We're gonna have the last one, Domingo Morel is also part of it, where we're gonna bring school districts like Providence, Lawrence Public School System, Central Falls in Rhode Island, and also Boston, who have familiarity when it comes to getting local control back. And so a lot of the work that I do is I go to the State House, and I stalk these state senators and House representatives, and I basically work with legislators who have an interest in education, and I work with them to pass actually bills and legislations that work for people who look like me, marginalized communities, right, to ensure that they have the education that they need. Providence is going through something very, very similar to what Lawrence is currently going through. They actually have a mixed, they have half is appointed and the other half is elected. And so Lawrence probably saw that, and now they're like, ooh, well, I think that's a great idea. Y'all, there's not enough research to prove that that actually works. I'm just putting it out there. And so right now, they're waiting for the mayor to appoint the other 5. I think the application deadline is actually December 13th. So we're not gonna know who's gonna get appointed yet. But we do know who our elected officials are. And so a lot of the fight that we're doing is we are working with community grassroots organizations, Policy Institute like ours, students, artists, to come all together to actually fight for the funding and the budgeting process to be more participatory so that people have a say into how to actually spend that money. Providence is a little bit different because there's a huge funding gap, where historically the city has not funded its school, and that's a fight in itself. I'm also happy to talk more about that. But what we're pushing for now is to actually create education collective coalition, because it doesn't exist in Providence and Rhode Island right now. There isn't a education collective coalition that actually fights the good fight for all different kind of policies. And I don't know if you guys know, that takes a lot of money and a lot of resources, and we're just nonprofit barely surviving. So we're trying to figure out how to do that power analysis and power mapping in order for us to get that representation needed moving forward. So in the next year, we're looking forward to partnering up with the organizations to continue to fight the good fight for what our kids deserve.
Thank you so much. Can I have a time check from somebody with a lanyard? 5? We got so much more to talk about. Okay, I'll try to consolidate. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, there's so many things we're dealing with, right? We're dealing with receivership, we're dealing with paying rent, we're dealing with the home rule petition, right? And then we have a new president-elect who says that he's going to dismantle the Department of Education, right? Lawrence is an interesting district because we get most of our money from the state, right? Not from the federal government and not from the city, right? We get about more than 90% from the state. What are the implications of dismantling the education of Department of Education for a city like Lawrence?
Well, you said it, right? So because not only Lawrence, but most districts, overwhelmingly most districts across the country get very, very little money from the federal government. They get about 10% of their budgets are from the federal government. It's really the states who provide most of the funding. So in relation to that, dismantling the Department of Education is not going to have a drastic effect on just funding, but it does have a drastic effect on so many other things, right? So when we're saying that, and we make a case, or try to make the case, that the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is occupying the Lawrence Public Schools. Who do you go to for help, right? You can't go to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts because they're the ones occupying. So generally in a federalist form of government, you have to go to the national government to get the help. And usually that's where communities of color have had to go to. So when you have a Trump presidency where he's saying, no, you're not gonna go to the Department of Education, and we know you can't go to the Department of Justice, where do you go? Right? And so that is really the key issue, that if you're fighting a struggle against the state, which you see as the problem, the federal government is supposed to provide some sort of support at the national level. But at the national level, we're not going to see that. So it creates, where do you go? Where do you go when you can't go to the state, you can't go to the national government? I think the answer to this within the short period, within the next at least 4 years, is going to have to be found in your own within your own communities. And what I mean by your own community is not just Lawrence. So Lawrence has to team up with Boston. Lawrence has to team up with Boston, has to team up with Lowell, has to team up with Springfield, has to team up with Providence, with Central Falls, make it a regional issue. So then be able to say, listen, we in the cities, we outnumber the entire state population. Our representatives outnumber you when we work collectively, and therefore that's the way that you start to attack this issue, because you're not going to find it at this, at the governor's office, and you're not going to find it in the Department of Education. So you have to coalesce with communities that are like you, experiencing things like you, which unfortunately is almost every damn community in this country is going through this. And I'm not exaggerating. Go through every major city in this country has either been taken over, is recently trying to regain local control, or is under threat, or was under threat to be taken over. Almost every. So there's a lot there to work with, because people are experiencing the same types of struggles.
Thank you so much for enlightening us. All right, and so as our final question, we can just go down. We can start with Angelica. What can each of us do to fight for a free LPS?
The first thing that I think we should do is awareness. That's one of the first things, because there's not enough awareness on the topic, especially for the kids in the schools, like we already touched. The kids really don't know what's going on. They don't know if it's their fault or somebody else's fault. And they're constantly being pointed at. People are telling them, Lawrence, you guys are the ones who are the bad ones, the ones bringing violence, the ones who are doing all of these things so that your schools are bad, but they don't really know where all of this is coming from and the roots of this problem. So first thing, awareness, education. Please tell the kids what takeover of LPS is. So put this documentary in your story so that those kids know what it is. So.
Yes, I co-sign that, and I want to say that I would encourage folks to get more civically engaged, and when I say that, I don't mean, just voting every 4 years. It's every 2 years we should be voting in our local elections, but we should vote and we should hold our elected officials accountable, because part of the problem is we're voting people into office, and whoever's filling up their pockets, or pulling their puppet strings, they're the ones that they're listening to, and they're not listening to us. And to, piggyback on what Domingo said regarding the funding issue, there are elected officials in Massachusetts who believe that because Lawrence only contributes 5% to the school budget, that we should have less of a democracy or less of a say as to what happens in our schools. And I think that's wrong. I think you can't tell a community that's struggling in poverty that they deserve less of a democracy. And so we have to start really holding our elected officials accountable and working in solidarity across communities throughout the Commonwealth so that we can really organize and really push back on what's happening.
I would say to lean in with each other in your community. Only you guys have that lived experience. That lived experience make you an expert. Not the person who's going to Brown or Columbia or reading books about your lived experience, and that policy impacts you. So it is your duty to show up for you, not just for yourself, but for your people and for each other, especially with these next 4 years. As someone who's gonna be at the State House day in and day out, fighting for the good fight, I am telling y'all, The damage that this man is about to do is gonna take us even more than 20 years to undo. Because I don't think people understand the reality. So lean into community, depend on each other, take care of each other, and listen. Sometimes it's not about you. It's about the greater good, right? As someone who is a Latina, who is white passing, I know somebody has it way harder than me, but I don't make it about myself, right? So lean into that discomfort, have messy conversations. You don't have to agree with everybody. You do not. It is impossible, right? But what you do have to do is find that one common goal, and is that we want the education that our, future students, who, by the way, they're the future. They're gonna be, when I'm old, they're gonna be making the decisions. I should care about that, right? And so we have to, I know we're exhausted, I know we're tired, but we're gonna have to show up for one another. Because if not, it's gonna be the same vicious cycle. And we can't be complicit to that. So we gotta show up. And I'm happy to talk to anyone about different, spaces to get involved, coalition building, what does that mean? Where can you get information? That's another thing that we're gonna be working on too, is how to spread information to make it accessible so that like your mom who has a 5th grade elementary school level can understand why she should care about, schooling. And yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, we need to be doing this. This is beautiful. Really, really. I mean, it's a Friday night, and you got these young kids who are here learning about, and engaging in this conversation, where most people will say that this is impossible, and it's not. It's not. And I was sharing this when we were recording this for this documentary, where it was all young Lawrence, Lawrence, I call them kids. I'm old enough to call you kids, so don't be offended by that. But it was just young Lawrence kids recording, showing their expertise, saying this is what I want to do. I'm like, this is what democracy looks like, right? And so just continuing to have these types of spaces, these types of conversations. And the last thing I would say is, because I was reminded by what you just said about messy. Democracy is messy. And they make it appear like if you don't make the perfect decisions, if everyone doesn't get along, if at the school board meeting they happen to be fighting or there's some sort of disagreement, they don't know what they're doing. And that's not what democracy is. And I'm a political science, I'll tell you, and I study not just local politics, state politics, national politics. There is not one place where there is politics that is not messy. Our president-elect is messy. The Congress is messy. State legislatures throughout this entire country are messy. And local government is messy. So don't believe for a second that because there's an argument or because somebody might have done something that they shouldn't have done, that should justify you losing your ability to participate in your democracy. And when you do regain local control of your schools, because it will happen, guess what? It's going to be messy. And people are going to make decisions that you don't agree with. Decisions that are like, man, that was dumb. But that's what democracy is like. And democracy is. And you just have to work through that. Do not let any of that justify removing your ability to govern yourselves. And, I'll end it at that. All right.
Wow, that was so beautiful. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you so much to y'all for coming out tonight. Final reminder before you head out, please visit the wall outside, and it asks you, how do we achieve a free LPS? You all have the answers, right? You all have lived this life, you've lived this experience, you've lived in this community. Please take some time to give us your feedback and fill out the fill out the survey, make sure you drop it in the box. And have a great night. See y'all later.